So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So, we were talking about the tafsir for the ayat 59 قل يا أهل الكتاب هل تنقمون منا. Now, I want to look at these ayat for a bit because there are a couple notes, even though we passed it, but there were some questions. I would be sitting down and just thinking about a number of different words. Well, why did it say that? Why did it say it that way? How do we understand all of that? قل يا أهل الكتاب هل تنقمون منا إلا أن آمنا بالله وما أنزل إلينا وما أنزل من قبل وأن أكثركم فاسقون. So when you look at the word هل تنقمون منا, what does it mean هل تنقمون? So I'm going to take you to Tafsir al-Qurtubi for a bit. And it goes on to, I guess, give us some details. So tanqimun means taskhatun. So they were feeling some form of not retaliation. So it wasn't a form of revenge, even though to basically go into some form of naqma is to really take revenge. But this isn't talking about any form of revenge. This is actually talking about why they were hating the Muslims, why they were having a grudge against the Muslims, why they were feeling that somehow they did not deserve to get the honor. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, tells us in another ayah. So the word tanqimun was only in the Quran, at least the root of it, was only in the Quran twice. Tanqimun in this ayah, where's that root? To hate, to have animosity, to disregard, to somehow go against. And there's another place that root actually came in, which is Surah al-Buruj. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا نَقَمُوا مِنْهُمْ إِلَّا أَن يُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ. That the main reason, the only reason that they had uh, punished or they had tortured the people of al-Burud, the people, of course, in Surah al-Buruj, the people of Ashab al-Ukhdud, was really because they had believed in al-Aziz al-Hamid. But here's one thing. Why tell us the story of Ashab al-Ukhdud? I mean, there were for sure many stories of torture or probably persecution that happened to people that believed in Salihin. So why that story in particular? There were many other stories that were similar to it. Many other stories of Salihin being tortured throughout history. But why mention Ashab al-Ukhdud out of all the stories that were out there? And same thing, when you're talking about so many different cases uh, within, of course, Sirah, where the Muslims were engaging in some battle and of course, ebb and flow. Sometimes they would win, sometimes they would get defeated. And why mention Uhud, for example? Why mention Badr? Why mention Yarmouk? They're only particular ones, even though there were other ones that happened in Islamic history. Why only those particular ones? And it's really important to mention that there is an Islamic definition, let's call it a Quranic definition, to what makes something stand out of all. And that is that pivotal point in history that really marks a change and marks a change, not necessarily politically or militarily, but marks a change in identity. And this is extremely important because you can have situations where, sorry about that. I need to turn off the fan. It's annoying me. sorry about that. You can have certain changes politically or even militarily and so forth, and it would continue as we would define those from our, let's say, military viewpoint that, well, this is the number of casualties there were, this is the number of at least the amount of money made. We would read things from that corner. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that that's not what actually marks the defeat or victory. And that's why in Sulh al-Hudaybiyah, when the Muslims had considered that the truce was nothing but a defeat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala marked it as a fath, as a major and a grand victory. Even though, if you were to look at the circumstance that Sulh al-Hudaybiyah happened in, you would see that there was no way that we were going to see in it from any angle that there was any victory. We're just going to see in it. So the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba, they attempt to go do Umrah because the Prophet ﷺ had a dream that they were doing Umrah. In other words, they're going to go do Umrah. The Muslims weren't prepared for any battle, but who wanted to seize the moment because they were not prepared, what was for the people of Quraysh. So they set to go for Umrah, but then the people of Quraysh prevented them. You're not going to come in. We're not going to allow you. And in fact, they wanted to provoke them into a battle by spreading rumors that the person that was considered the ambassador sent on behalf of the Muslims, which was Uthman bin Affan, that he was killed. And therefore, to provoke the Muslims to consider that as an act of war. But the Muslims weren't prepared for any of this. The Muslims were prepared that they were setting off for Umrah, and that's why the weapons, the animals, their animals were with them for sacrifice and etc. So now they're waging an act of war. But the Prophet ﷺ, of course, then later on, they would have different, I guess, different figures to come and see with the Prophet ﷺ on how they can settle on a certain truce. It isn't until, of course, Sahih, and his name, of course, we're speaking about Suhail ibn Amr. Suhail ibn Amr. His name is Suhail ibn Amr. Suhail actually means easy. Suhail ibn Amr. And by the way, Suhail ibn Amr was known to being a person that was very eloquent. Khatib, mufawwah. In fact, he was one of those key figures within Quraysh. And it was said that he had proposed for Hind bint Utbah. Who's Hind bint Utbah? Abu Sufyan's wife. But Hind bint Utbah was more interested in Abu Sufyan. But Suhail ibn Amr was known that he was very eloquent. So Suhail ibn Amr, when he goes to negotiate the truce, Suhail ibn Amr, the Prophet ﷺ says, Sahula amrukum. Just taking the inspiration from his name. Sahula amrukum. It's going to be an easy one. Just taking by the inspiration from the name. Taking it from there. Looking at what the truce, at least the different categories, the different elements, that anybody that becomes Muslim is going to be rejected. In other words, there's no there's no support to be given to these new Muslims. You are to not consider them as an addition to the Muslim community, but you're going to return them to us. We talked about the details for that. But then the ayah considered that إِنَّا فَتَحْنَا لَكَ فَتْحًا مُبِينًا, that was a major victory. How is it a major victory when our honor was at that moment, we were defeated, we were returned, we were dishonored? How is it that it was a victory? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling them to read things not based on that particular moment, but to read things 10 years from now, or perhaps even more, in order to understand things not based on your impulsive reaction, based on your emotions at that time. And this is extremely important, what it means. And this is something to teach our children. Don't let your emotions determine what decisions you would make. Because the second that you would let your emotions determine your decision making, you had then not made your decisions based on the data, but then you had made the decisions based on your, whether it's hormones or whether it's feelings. Then you're not reading the data. You're not looking at the information that you would have, but you're looking at things based on your emotions at that time, and that could be a manipulation. It could be a manipulation. And that's actually what I would want to discuss right there. When were the people of al-Ukhdud, when were they living? When did that happen? So historians would say Ashab al-Ukhdud happened in between the time of Prophet Isa alayhi salam and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we're looking at a time where there were really no prophets in between. No prophets in between. So we're looking at a time when Christianity at the time was more heading towards a political redefinition from Prophet Isa alayhi salam being as the prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to a new political definition that wanted to give divinity to Prophet Isa alayhi salam. But there was a group that did not want to believe and succumb to this political pressure. And that was Ashab al-Ukhdud. Ashab al-Ukhdud, they didn't want to succumb to the political pressure. Now, this was a pivotal moment that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَمَا نَقَمُوا مِنْهُمْ إِلَّا أَن يُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ. That the only reason why they had basically tortured them in that way was for one main reason, that they believed in al-Aziz al-Hamid, even though technically they were all killed. So in politics, we would say, well, they didn't really win. They all got killed. That's the end of them. In other words, there was no victory. They definitely got defeated because they were all killed. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues the ayat and says that no. وَمَا نَقَمُوا مِنْهُمْ إِلَّا يُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ, and then continues إِنَّ الَّذِينَ فَتَنُوا الْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ, and then tells us that فَلَهُمْ عَذَابُ جَهَنَّمَ وَلَهُمْ عَذَابُ الْحَرِيقِ. Did the story end? Well, from the person that was living at the time, we would say they're the birth of a new civilization, which is what they wanted to do. A civilization of Iman was killed, and that was the end of them. Therefore, nothing remained of them. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said no. their legacy remained, and in fact, they continue to be this group that was between the time of Prophet Isa alayhi salam and Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How is that a legacy to continue? But they were killed. There was nothing remained of them. How is it that they were to continue? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned them. And for us to understand that what defines victory, think of Inna fatahna laka fatham mubina. Think of these people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them Jannah. What marks victory is not necessarily people's data in this life, but what marks as victory as what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considered as the legacy and the continuation, of course, of that dhikr, of that da'wah, of that legacy, of that which transcends this dunya to mark as the victory in akhirah. The victory in akhirah. That's the main victory. So in this dunya, you could see, for example, the people of Gaza. We would think, well, what happened? Look, October 7th, look at how many people had been killed right now. What? We lost count. Before we were saying 20, 30,000. Now we lost count. Is it 43? Is it 45,000? Is it 50,000? We lost count. Because we would think, and if somebody is to look at this, they would say, look, what did we do? What did these people that wanted to bring about some form of a war do? And look what they had caused. They caused the death of 50,000 people. They had caused, that's a defeat. They were to count it from that angle. But you want to keep in mind that what happened is completely unprecedented, which even Israel recognizes. And that's why right now they're going into Lebanon. They're going into Lebanon, that is Israel, not necessarily because they wanted to just expand. Well, that was something that they wanted to do from before, but because they also recognize that October 7th marks something that was unprecedented in, of course, for the Israeli Shabak, which is kind of like the Israeli CIA, or even the Israeli power. They wanted to say, look, we're able to pin down Hassan Nasrallah. We're able to throw a whole ton of all these explosives, even if he was somehow, 6 stories down or 8 stories down in some kind of an underground thing, but they still recognize that they were not capable of getting or finding their hostages. They were not capable of saving not even one. They recognize that what really happened is an issue of a rise of an identity, the rise of an identity which basically happened on October 7th, the rise of an identity that no, there is a way where we could one day end this injustice. We were capable of doing and reviving the feeling of victory, even if it was for a couple of days. But that's because, and in fact, even if we were capable of proving to the world that Israel is a country that would not be capable of standing without the different tyrants in the Western countries out there. It's really not even for the Western population, the Western people's interest, but it is against the interest of even European countries. And now you could see like never before that people are recognizing that even the Western politicians are not working in favor of their own people's interests. Now, this is why is this taking us into وَمَا نَقَمُوا مِنْهُمْ? When you look at وَمَا نَقَمُوا مِنْهُمْ and you look at the ayah, قل يا أهل الكتاب هل تنقمون منا. You look at the ayah, same thing, that there is a certain feeling, a certain moment that they would somehow consider that their reason for the revenge, the reason why we need to pin you down as basically Muslims, or even during the time of Ashab al-Ukhdud, they would market it and proselytize it within their community that it was to maintain and keep some form of peace, because they would market this group that is trying to bring Iman, trying to bring justice. They would proselytize them and market them that they're doing nothing but bringing in instability. They're bringing in injustice. They're not bringing in civilization and so forth. Well, that's the same thing when you look at Fir'aun. What did Fir'aun say? Let's actually look at this ayah. We're going to look at this ayah. إني أخاف أن يبدل دينكم أو أن يظهر في الأرض الفساد. Let's look at this ayah and look at the context of it. Okay, we're going to look at this ayah, look at the context of it. What did, let's see this one. Okay, let's see. What did he say? وقال فرعون ذروني أقتل موسى وليدعو ربه إني أخاف أن يبدل دينكم أو أن يظهر في الأرض الفساد. What happened? So Fir'aun said, allow me to kill Musa. Well, what do you mean, allow me? I thought you were the king. He wanted to make them believe that he was basically taking their opinion. It was their vote. It was their wish. It was manipulating the society, that he was somewhat of, kind of like what we would say today. It's marking it, it's a freedom of speech, that it's democracy, that it's your vote, and that he's not acting as a dictator. وَلْيَدْعُ رَبَّهُ إِنِّي أَخَافُ أَن يُبَدِّلَ دِينَكُمْ. Now he's doing another form of marketing himself. إِنِّي أَخَافُ. I fear that he will change your religion. In other words, change your principles. He's probably going to be this threat within our society, أو يظهر في الأرض الفساد, or probably reveal some form of corruption. Now, Fir'aun, you're speaking of corruption. You're the one that actually made the religion be based on worshiping you, that you were the God. And you were the one that was enslaving people to work for your sake, to work for, of course, making all these tombs basically just for you. And it was somehow presented like it was creating a civilization. And what were you doing? You were enslaving the women, the children, and killing the men, or making the men work for your, of course, labor, but it was to make all of this really centered around you. But just look into that and just see the rhetoric that was used. And the rhetoric is not any different from the rhetoric of today. Well, a lot of these politicians, they're making you think that you are free to choose. And what are you doing? You're putting in and selecting these votes, and in order to vote for them, and certainly in order to make them be the ones to speak for you, you're going to basically pay them. And how much are you paying them? Well, guess what? They would get millions and millions per year. In other words, it's a form of a business. They're using you to make you believe that it is basically your representation, but they're the only ones that are getting richer. Are you getting richer? The answer is no. And they are also making you believe that the system itself is what actually made the civilization. Not that the civilization, just imagine this. When you're looking at the so-called Western civilization, it's really interesting. Just an idea. Just imagine that whether you're speaking about France, Germany, UK, etc., just look at this. Germany, a couple days back, actually apologized for Tanzania for committing all those genocides in Tanzania. But here's what we don't know. It wasn't just Tanzania. It was Namibia as well. And guess how many people they killed? They actually killed more than 300,000 people. You know what they did? There was this agreement between Western countries that they would literally split African countries amongst them. Why? Because the black man is incapable of thinking. The black man is behind in his mental capacity to create any civilization because anyways, according to the theory of evolution, black man is closer to the ape man. Therefore, white man is more civilized, and white man needs to intervene in order to help black man somehow go up in their ability to make a civilization. So black man should not be capable of judging or determining the resources in Africa. Why? Because black man is an ape man. This is the definition that they basically lived on. So therefore, when Germany basically colonized Tanzania and colonized those countries, then of course they had discovered that there was rubber trees that were making rubber. But in order to make that and of course get that rubber out of those trees, they needed, of course, laborers. Who was going to be the laborer? They weren't going to get Germans to work in those African fields. No, they needed to make those farmers the Africans themselves in order to basically get paid or to get any form of payment. They basically, of course, the Western countries, they presented this whole thing of splitting Africa, that it was a project to bring about civilization and prosperity to African countries. That's the way that it was presented. It was presented like it was to bring about prosperity, civilization, and education to the African countries. Why? Because it was presented that these people cannot do it on their own. They needed the white man intervention to make this happen. So that's when they basically forced the Namibians that, hey, what you need to do in order for you to basically protect yourself from getting killed, you have to work in those fields. So in order to basically work in those fields, you needed to bring about an amount, I guess, of that rubber. You needed to present it to, I guess, every single area had its I guess, officer that was representing, of course, Germany, which considered itself that it's the legal owner of those resources. If you didn't bring this amount, you are going to basically get killed. How are you going to get killed? Well, you weren't going to get killed from the first day. No, they were extremely merciful. So we would chop off your hand if you were caught a couple times not bringing in the amount of rubber that you were supposed to. And if you still didn't present it, then we're going to chop off another hand. And if you still didn't do it, then we're going to chop off your private parts. And then, of course, This caused some form of an uproar in the West when they had discovered, well, wait a minute, this is not humane. And of course, the West was presenting itself with all this renaissance, that it was somehow the area that the foundation of human rights, the foundation of the greatest thinking, the greatest civilization, the greatest way of what man had basically reached and all of that. But then when the people had realized, I guess, the discrepancy between the rhetoric that was spread and the rhetoric that it was taught and the practice that it was doing in Africa, that's when they basically had went into, I guess, some form of marching against it, that's not acceptable. And what happened? Well, then they changed the policy. Well, what we can do, we'll just still give ourselves the legality to steal those resources because the West was dependent, at least Germany was dependent on the resources that were there. So what should we do now? Well, we could just imprison. That's at least what we could do, because we needed to make those Africans work for us. So it was given that it was legal and that it was let's call it a more humanitarian way to enslave these people. Not that the whole idea of stealing such resources was in itself inhumane, but it was seen, well, it was bringing some prosperity, therefore it should be at least the means, the ends that justify the means. So it was bringing us prosperity, so somehow we would just have to accept it. Same thing when we're talking about Iraq, that, hey, it was according to Madeleine Albright, well, it was justifiable to kill all those children, 1 million people, and kill them in Iraq, and even use uranium just to basically consider that, hey, we needed the oil. So it was important for our companies. It was important for Western prosperity to steal the oil. So even if we don't have any evidence to prove the correlation between September 11 and Saddam Hussein, it was enough to just say that, hey, we need the oil. Even if it was not proven that there was or there were any weapons of mass destruction, even though it proved that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and that was nothing but a lie made up by Tony Blair, George W. Bush, and of course Donald Rumsfeld and all of those. But it was, hey, just brushed under the carpet. So it was proven a lie. So big deal. Don't make it a big deal. But then, of course, justify that, no, a whole nation in Iraq that was really going up, at least in civilization, but they needed to make sure that no country was going up the civilization and competing with the Western civilization whatsoever. So what do? We basically convince the masses that we are somehow supporting justice and proselytize it, that it was basically to help create a civilization. Well, taking us back, and you're probably wondering, how is that related whatsoever to what we were talking about in terms of course, وَمَا نَقَمُوا مِنْهُمْ إِلَّا يُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ. For the first time in history, you could see that whether we're talking about the US or the West, or even, of course, Israel, is basically right now exposed, where you would see South Africa, many African countries are right now saying, well, no, we're not going to necessarily accept that secularism and what was ruling for a number of years. We're speaking about from the time, of course, of World War for World War I. World War II was really considered as the Western victory, the Western supremacy that was taking over, and therefore Western supremacy was the definition of morality, was the definition of victory, was the definition of civilization, was the definition of superpower. And right now, you could see that we're living in a time of history where this had actually been exposed to the masses. And I'm not talking about exposed to the Muslim masses, but I'm talking about exposed to the Western masses themselves. The Western masses, why is that even important? Because I want you to recognize that Fir'aun himself, he recognized that the masses, the population itself, he needed to gain their vote / their acceptance / of course, their support in order for him to do whatever political, military intervention, whatever it is, he needed to get their acceptance because he couldn't have done it alone. And this is extremely important. When we're speaking about military, when we're speaking about politics, we're actually talking about the masses and the population itself. Once they are awakened, that's when the change will happen. It was not whatsoever going to be possible unless it was the people that were supporting Fir'aun. Of course, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable of doing everything, but it wasn't until the magicians themselves that they had exposed Fir'aun and exposed that, no, this was a lie. When they had submitted themselves to Prophet, submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to Prophet Musa alayhi salam, and then Fir'aun gets angry and says, well, I'm going to أصلبنكم في جذوع النخل, not على جذوع النخل, but في جذوع النخل. Why في? The word في is in. It's not like you're going to put them in the tree trunks, but no, he was so furious. He got so angry that he was not only going to torture them on the tree trunks, of course, the palm tree trunks, but he wanted them to completely be fastened in such a hard way that it would be made as if they are actually part of the tree trunk itself. They are so completely fastened that their bodies were fused, literally fused in the tree trunks. Just imagine the amount of torture that they were facing. But of course, Fir'aun did that, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us about Is-Sahara, even though there was the magicians and how they basically marked this change in history. And this is important to keep in mind, that there are certain times, even though when you look at the situation, did the magicians make it? No, the magicians were actually killed. The magicians didn't make it. The magicians were killed, the magicians were tortured, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned it because it was a legacy of victory. It was a legacy of awakening. Same thing when you look at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us in Surah Yasin, جاء رجل من أقصى المدينة يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين. Let's look at that ayah. Let's look at this ayah because let's see. جاء رجل, وجاء رجل من أقصى المدينة يسعى. Let's look at the story. What happened? Let's look at it and actually see how this is related to all of this. What happened? Let's look at it. وجاء رجل من أقصى المدينة يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أأتخذ من دونه آلهة يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون. I want you to look at this one. What happened? You actually go before that. What happened? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us the story. أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون. What happened? Well, this village, this city, they basically had different prophets. And of course, different prophets, عززنا بثالث, a third prophet, a second prophet, and they would come to them that they're actually prophets. قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا. What did they say? Well, they basically objected and said, you're just humans like us. We're not going to believe any of this. And Rahman, he didn't send anything down. It's basically just a magnificent lie made from you. In other words, nothing but blasphemy. And they said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that we're prophets sent to you, and we're basically sent with one duty, which is to inform you of it and make it a clear, revelation to you. So what they said, قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم. What did they say? Well, they said, well, we had used different forms, تطيرنا, different forms of fortune telling, that is. And based on the fortune telling and based on looking at the tatayur, what is a tatayur? A tatayur is when they would go out and they would see, let's say, a black crow going left side, and they would say, well, that's a sign, that's a bad omen. Based on those signs, we had seen that you're basically nothing but liars. In other words, they created their own way of considering what would make considerable data. And they said, if that based on that, لَإِن لَمْ تَنْتَهُوا لَنَرْجُمَنَّكُمْ وَلَيَمَسَّنَّكُمْ مِنَّا عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ. They said, well, based on that, if you do not stop and end the da'wah that you're doing, we're going to stone you and we're going to torture you. قَالُوا طَائِرُكُمْ مَعَكُمْ. They said, this method of the superstition that you're doing is really just something made up by you. أَإِن ذُكِّرْتُمْ بَلْ أَنْتُمْ قَوْمٌ مُسْرِفُونَ. Look at you. You're basically creating a data, and based on that data, you're judging me based on a data that you had created, and you just imagined. It's nothing but superstition that was made from you. But here's one thing. What stands out in the story, because this is also common, we had seen they would create a data, they would create their own definition, and then judge you based on their definition. They would create the definition, and then they would judge you based on that definition, and they would say whether we're going to consider it as ethical or not based on their own definition. So that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stands out in the story. A man, was his name mentioned? He wasn't mentioned because the story is not necessarily based on what the name was. But the story here emphasizes that a man came, and the word is أقصى المدينة. What is أقصى المدينة? أقصى المدينة, it's a faraway city, far away in a place where I guess wasn't so easy for him to make this journey, but he still did whatever he can in order to bring about his witness and bring about his support. Here you could see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is blessing this legacy that he had left behind, which is, even though he didn't necessarily get, I guess, his word heard, but still Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears the word, even though the community, the society didn't hear the word, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala heard it. What did he say? قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين. He said, Ya qawm, O people, follow those prophets. اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. They're not asking you for a pay. What are they asking you? They themselves, they're not living in discrepancies. They're actually embracing the principles that they're trying to teach. وهم مهتدون. And you could see that they're even living a life of guidance. And then, وَمَا لِيَ لَا أَعْبُدُ الَّذِي فَطَرَنِي وَإِلَيْهِ تُرْجَعُونَ. What was his evidence for all of this? He says, well, why would I not worship the one that created me? In other words, it's supposed to be whatever you would want to regard as ethical, it's supposed to be based on the foundation that goes in parallel with what you see, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in nature. And you could say, وَإِلَيْهِ تُرْجَعُونَ. There was a purpose that preceded your existence. And that's why he said, وَإِلَيْهِ تُرْجَعُونَ. I want you to look into the world around you. You could see that there was a pattern he was capable of exposing to them. You could see the pattern, and based on the pattern, that there is a purpose that all this pattern is leading us to, which is there is a meaning to why you were existent. You have to recognize that these prophets are coming to tell you that there is a meaning that you have to find, that you have to search for, that these prophets are making it easy for you to recognize that this life was not created in absurdity. It wasn't created for no purpose at all, but you were created to test you on whether you are going to submit to your Lord Almighty's principles and not the principles that you had somehow founded your own superstition. أَأَتَّخِذُ مِن دُونِهِ آلِهَةً. Now he's taking it, it seems like they had rejected him. Seems like his, I guess, his contribution, his somehow solidarity, the legacy that he was trying to put in, the support he was trying to give the prophets, definitely you could see in between the lines that he too was facing some form of an objection, some form of a torture. Who knows what he was facing? But that's when he would announce, أَأَتَّخِذُ مِن دُونِهِ آلِهَةً إِن يُرِدْنِ الرَّحْمَنُ بِضُرٍّ لَا تُغْنِ عَنِّي شَفَاعَتُهُمْ شَيْئًا وَلَا يُنقِذُونَ. Why should I take any other Lord, any other God, deity, when if the Lord Almighty, Ar-Rahman, why did he say Ar-Rahman and not God? He said Ar-Rahman because he recognizes by looking at the world that the Lord Almighty is the foundation of mercy, is the foundation for any good that is happening in his life. So he said, all that what the gods might actually want to somehow do, there's nothing that they could do. They can't even change anything to themselves, let alone change anything in my life. Then I would be living nothing but in a delusion, thinking that I'm basically on the right side, but I would then be living in just a self-manipulation. Inni amantu bi rabbikum fasma'un. I believed in your Lord. So fasma'un, it's like saying, well, hear me. You don't want to hear this? That's your choice. But fasma'un, hear me. And I'm just letting you know that I'm not going to follow what you're doing. I'm basically going to follow these prophets. Even if none of you want to believe in any of this, hear me. And now you're witnesses that I am right there announcing it. And here's one thing. You could see that this man, he didn't get the support, didn't get a political support, didn't get any support, and didn't get the media to say anything about him. No one was whatsoever regarding and giving him any attention. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, قِيلَ دُخُلِ الْجَنَّةِ. But your Lord Almighty recognizes the effort that he had contributed. The Lord Almighty recognizes the words and announced it and made the words that he had said be the words that would be read in the Quran in Surah Yasin, which is one of the most surahs that is read in the Quran. قِيلَ دُخُلِ الْجَنَّةِ. Then he was told, أُدْخُلِ الْجَنَّةِ. You're going to enter Jannah. What did he say? قَالَ يَا لَيْتَ قَوْمِي يَعْلَمُونَ. I wish my people would have known all of this. I wish they would have I wish they would have known and they would have seen this. I wish they What did he want? He wanted his people, he wished that his people would have known the truth in order for them to be included in Jannah. What did he want? He wanted his people to enter with him in Jannah. بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين. And he also wanted his people to know the consequence of what legacy and what choices that he had made in this dunya. And that the consequence was that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forgiven him. وَجَعَلَنِي مِنَ الْمُكْرَمِينَ, and made me from al-Mukramin. Why al-Mukramin? Al-Mukramin, because they had thought that he was part of, what's the opposite of Mukram? Muhan. They had thought by disregarding him, by somehow, of course, silencing him, they thought that he was nothing but a person that was humiliated, didn't give him a voice, didn't give him any attention, humiliated, disregarded. So he said, وَجَعَلَنِي مِنَ الْمُكْرَمِينَ. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making me amongst the honorable ones. I want you to look at this one, because when you look at this ayah and you could see وَمَا أَنزَلْنَا عَلَى قَوْمِهِ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ مِنْ جُنْدٍ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ وَمَا كُنَّا مُنزِلِينَ. You could see where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that this is a legacy, and those stories are basically to mark وَمَا نَقَمُوا مِنْهُمْ إِلَّا يُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ. The same area. Well, what actually marks as victory? And that change is not necessarily what the people during our times, what they would regard as victory, what they would regard as making those pivotal moments in change in life or in society or in civilization. It's basically how committed that person and that group is on the legacy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the key thing. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling us in this surah, I want you to look at this one, telling us in this surah, of course, let's go back to seeing it within the context of those ayat. قل يا أهل الكتاب هل تنقمون منا إلا أن آمنا بالله وما أنزل إلينا وما أنزل من قبل وأن أكثركم فاسقون. Well, tell the people of the book, are you really just attacking us, basically? Are you really just trying to, right there, bring about some form of going against us just because of one thing? Amanna billah. When, of course, to you, that is the Ahl al-Kitab, to them, they were proselytizing themselves as people of scripture, people of faith. But the reason why they were attacking the Muslims, it was really because they were wanting to go back to the faith. And they saw that there were some, at least, comparison between what was revealed in the Torah and what was revealed in their scripture and what was revealed in the Quran. And in fact, the Quran then exposes them, وَأَنَّ أَكْثَرَكُمْ فَاسِقُونَ. Most of you are nothing but really practicing fisq. I want to compare that during our times in our society. During our times, you could see that the society, at least the liberal society, and even the Western society, would always, of course, accuse Islam of a religion that is really a religion of lust. And then they would say, well, look, they're actually permitting polygamy, marrying 4 wives, and therefore it's a religion that is somehow against women's rights, it's against human rights, it's against all of that. And then they would present it that it's a religion that is based on lust and not a religion of faith and not a religion of purity. And it's so weird how, groups that are right now considering that if you do not support LGBT, then you're actually against people's sexual orientation, and therefore you should be considered as against human rights. And of course, when you look at CEDAW, which is right now the United Nations, I would say, new Bible for family law and what defines family rights. It's basically CEDAW, CEDAW. You can look it up. The book, the catalog, the whatever, their new Bible, they would actually have it for you, PDF online. You could download it. It doesn't need much. Okay. You could see right there that it's all in support of things like prostitution and to basically let women be an easy target where a lot of these traffickers, a lot of these, I would say, companies are then having an easy access to women. So what is it? It's to isolate the fathers, isolate the men from having any power to expose and protect the women. And that way they could have all this free access to the women by manipulating them and telling them that it's all about freedom. That's the same thing Pharaoh had done. Basically wanted to manipulate the society, that it's all about your freedom. And of course, let's go for another ayah. uh, did we expose that ayah? إني أخاف أن يبدل دينكم. إني أخاف أن يبدل دينكم. Yeah, we did that ayah just earlier. And what was Pharaoh saying? I fear that he would change your religion. Did he really care about the religion? Did he really care about uh, any faith that they were holding on to? Well, what he was really caring, that he wanted them to think, and he was manipulating them, that it was an issue of a principle. He was really wanting them to believe that it was an issue of principle, that he was a man of faith, that he was a man of principle, that he was a man of humanity, that he was a man of justice, and that's what he wanted to basically manipulate the masses to think that he was doing. And that same manipulation that of the likes, whether we're speaking about CEDAW or right now, of course, the liberalism and all those isms out there, secularism and all of those, and feminism want to right now play the same game. And of course, would attack the Muslims, attack, of course, the different things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as part of Sharia. And they would basically come in and say, well, no, this is how they would come in. Look at that Sharia, it's all against human rights. It's all against women's rights. It's all against this. But then, وَأَنَّ أَكْثَرَكُمْ فَاسِقُونَ. How are you then pretending to come forward to be a person of justice, a person of human rights, a person of women's rights, when you are basically practicing nothing but fisq? You're right there asking for abortion, as an example, and in support of women's rights. But then you didn't want to expose that you're really committing nothing but fisq, nothing but going against what is even more vulnerable than the woman that is right there. What is even more vulnerable is basically this human being that can't even defend itself. That's in the mother's womb. Isn't that supposed to be fisq right there? What defines morality? Who defines morality? And of course, they would put themselves, remember how inna tatayyarna bikum? They would consider that they would be the ones to define morality, and based on that definition, they would want to judge the Muslims. They would want to judge Islam and Muslims and say, well, we're the ones that define morality, and therefore we would be the ones to judge you based on that definition. And based on our definition, we would be the ones to determine whether you fit in that definition or whether you don't fit in that definition. So if you're calling for sexual orientation, well, how did you exclude polygamy from having, the right to at least have such an orientation? No, we can't let it in. We can't accept polygamy. Well, why did you accept same sex? No, we would define whether it's an orientation or not. You don't get to define. Well, how did you exclude polygamy? We excluded it because it has a legacy, goes back to the main religion that considered polygamy, the main religion, of course, even though it's in the Torah, even though it's in the Bible, but of course, they didn't want to. And right now, Christians and Jews, they're not standing up for polygamy. They're not standing up for Sharia. They're not standing up for the revelation, because again, it's basically just like the past. Because right there, even though they recognize unzila ilayna and unzila min qabl, remember it was part of the Sharia even from your times. It was part of the Sharia during our times. It was part of the Sharia even before. But no, أن أكثركم فاسقون. They basically want to define what is part of the scripture or what remains of the scripture and what is to be excluded of it. And therefore, they would be the ones to determine what makes and what defines morality and what goes out of morality. And therefore, they would be the ones to determine what makes truth and what doesn't make truth. Exactly like that man that we were just reading about, where what he was saying, what they were saying actually, إِنَّا تَطَيَّرْنَا بِكُمْ. They said, well, we looked at the superstition, and based on that, we basically had come to a final conclusion that you're nothing but an imposter, and they're nothing but imposters, and therefore we're going to judge you based on the made up, here we go, based on our made up definition. And based on that, we're going to classify you as nothing but imposters, because that's what our made up paradigm had basically. We can change the paradigm whenever we want, and we'll change the paradigm based on how we want that dress to fit, that paradigm to fit our choices, not your choices. And that's the same thing. That's why I started out talking about Africa. It was their choices of what defines, that is the means, the ends to justify the means. And therefore, you could see right now, you could see whether it's the US, whether it's Australia, whether it's South America, you could see, of course, it was justifiable to kill all the natives and all those people and basically use different forms of sterilization, different forms of killing. And right now we'll just talk about putting, of course, the Native Americans in certain enclaves, really in certain areas, we would call them, just like that, that time when in Dakota, of course, when they wanted to take even those areas and say, we're going to build some area that basically supports and brings about, of course, the resources to the main government, even though it was supposed to be against the agreement that they had agreed on. But hey, who said we have to abide by any agreement? We're the ones that would define where the agreement begins and when the agreement ends. It's basically the superpower that determines what it means to define justice, what it means, to end it, where it ends, and where it begins. And that's the same thing with Africa. With Africa, they determined what makes basically justifiable to colonize a certain country, and when it ends, and when it doesn't end. And therefore, even when we're speaking about stealing the resources, it's justifiable. And of course, even when we're speaking about classifying these people as, well, they're basically backwards. And even speaking about, guess what? In that Namibia story, they're the men that were imprisoned. You think they were just imprisoned? Remember the story about those that refused to do and work in those rubber fields? Guess what happened? They took the men and women and imprisoned them, but guess what they did? The men, they injected them with different illnesses just to do medical research on them. And of course, hey, it's done for medical research. It's a good thing. It's for medical research. It's presented like it's done for a good cause, for science. And the women, they were basically given, literally given to the soldiers in those military bases for Germany in order to do what? They were given to the military and basically to work as what? Laborers? No. They were there, not laborers, but they were actually to do one type of labor, sex labor. They were there to get raped. That's it. But it was brought about that it was justifiable. And that's what, of course, the Western countries at the time were, well, until the time of today, were basically presenting themselves that it was to bring about a civilization to Africa. It was to bring about prosperity. It was to bring about advancement, education, and so forth. Well, that's not too long ago, but that's the same thing when we're speaking about right now in Gaza. Same thing. Well, hey, we're right there trying to tell them to go out. We're trying to tell them to give them freedom. And that's the same thing. Netanyahu, when he was talking to the Iranians, he was telling them, hey, you know, these phonetic religious figures, they're basically trying to distance you away from your Persian legacy, away from your heritage, away from the different resources. They're taking all the resources, the same exact rhetoric, the same exact game, without us realizing that many times, you know, you could see that colonizing, whether it's from the time of Prophet Musa alayhi salam and how Fir'aun was playing the game, or whether it's the time وَمَا نَقَمُوا مِنْهُمْ إِلَّا يُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ, till the time of today, playing the same game, redefining morality, redefining justice, and then judging Sharia based on that, or judging revelation based on their definitions. And if you don't go by their definitions, you would then be tortured. You would then be somehow brought to, of course, the media, that you're nothing but a person of morality. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is right there exposing them, telling them, actually, you do recognize أَنَّ أَكْثَرَكُمْ فَاسِقُونَ. Most of you are actually the ones that are immoral. You know very well that the reason why you had actually legalized a number of different things, whether it's legalized LGBT or legalized a lot of the different things about, of course, pornography, and legalized drinking and legalized all of that. Well, that's because that's your lifestyle. because that's the lifestyle that you want to live, because you yourself are actually immoral and you want others to embrace that. And then you basically had decided to draw the line to include that type of immorality and presented it that it was nothing but to protect human rights. You drew the line, you made the line, and then you wanted me to abide by it. And you wanted me to basically say and judge the religion based on your rules, based on your definitions. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exposes that. قُلْ هَلْ أُنَبِّئُكُمْ بِشَرٍّ مِّن ذَلِكَ مَثُوبَةً عِندَ اللَّهِ. I want to look at this one. When you're looking at this ayah, it basically exposes them, and then it basically comes in a context of what? In a context of al-wala. What does that have to do with anything? What does that, why al-wala? Because for a Muslim, let's take you to that ayah. What do we got? 126 right there. I'm going to take you to another ayah. We're going to get back to it. Okay, let's see. And we're going to go to Surah An-Najm. What about with Surah An-Najm? Remember with Surah An-Najm, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right there, وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ. We read that yesterday. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, he doesn't speak of any desire, in other words, not of his own self, or what is it? In huwa illa wahyun yuha. It's nothing but a wahy yuha. It's nothing but a revelation from, of course, sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allamahu shadidul quwa. But then it goes on and basically tells us that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was basically something that was a revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then I want you to look at this one. When, of course, he wanted to expose and let them recognize their ideas and where it's coming from, he says, "In hiya illa asma'un sammaytumuha." They're basically asma', the names, whether it's al-Manat or Lat, al-Uzza, or the different gods. And it's not just the gods, the names of the gods, but that's also the different things that they would define morality based on. They would create their own definition, their own paradigm, their own border, and then they would give it a name. And it wasn't just them, but it was also, there's a trace back even in ancestry. So right now we're talking about, I guess, we're talking about the West today, and then we'll go back to perhaps John Locke and of course the different philosophers and David Hume and all these different philosophers that trace back. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling, well, I want you to recognize, because the story is the same. The story, it's not something new. There's a whole list of all these different philosophers, all these different, of course, figures that had basically presented all of this. And then, مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ بِهَا مِن سُلْطَانٍ. There's no evidence to support it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't even send you any evidence. In other words, not in the open book, not in nature, and not in the revealed book, and not even in the scripture. إِيَّتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ. In the end, what they would follow is ilvan, speculation, which could be presented by their fathers, could be presented by perhaps different philosophers, whatever it is, and it is presented like it's nothing but facts. وَمَا تَهْوَى الْأَنفُسِ. And of course, وَمَا تَهْوَى الْأَنفُسِ, and what their whims would desire. In other words, they would create these lobbies. These lobbies would define what it means to be in a certain morality, on a certain type of life, on a certain basis. And of course, they would present one, they would spend, of course, present the different rhetoric, the different narratives to support such hawa, such desire. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم مِّن رَبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى. Well, the Lord Almighty had sent them the guidance, so they are going to choose. They could just realize all the speculation that they would present. أَمْ لِلْإِنسَانِ مَا تَمَنَّى. Is it really based on your own choices, your own whims? Just because you want something to probably be halal, it doesn't have to be halal because you wish that it was. So Islam is telling us, فَلِلَّهِ الْآخِرَةُ وَالْأُولَى. When we're speaking about morality, when we're speaking about principle, when we're speaking about purpose cannot contradict al-akhirah and al-ula. In order for any morality, in order for any behavior to be right or wrong, it's not enough to see the consequences or at least the results in what it leads to in this life. We also need to see farther than this life in what it leads probably 100 years from now or even farther, which should not contradict the purpose that you were created for. وَكَمْ مِنْ مَلَكٍ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ لَا تُغْنِي شَفَاعَتُهُمْ شَيْئًا. We're going to get to this point, but let's go, inshallah, we're going to continue. What does this have to do with anything? I'm going to share a slide right there. Be patient with me because there's really a lot to connect the dots together. All right. So the basis of morality, there were a number of studies, even, of course, in the West, they would have a number of different studies. Well, what is theory and what are ethics really based on? And there were these different ethical theories. These theories, whether it's the utilitarian theory, which basically considers, well, in order for us to call something as moral or ethical, we would look in seeing the greatest good for the greatest number. If it brings the greatest good for the greatest number, then that should make it as on a smaller scale, that should make it good. And of course, the egoism, it would say, well, you would need to focus on yourself. If it maximizes the good, if it maximizes happiness to you, then therefore that's an evidence that this is good. And of course, they'll look at, of course, the consequences will see how it produces the most benefit or the most happiness. And if it produces the most happiness, and if people are accepting it, people are taking it, and then that should be proving that something is good. And therefore, that's the action that we should be performing, whether as individuals or as a society. And of course, you would see another theory that would say that no, we're actually going to look at things differently, and we're going to study things based on the different categories, and we're going to look at the situation and on a universal level on how much of good would that bring about within the society. Therefore, if it brings good, then therefore it's good. Let's see the other one. You've got, well, we're going to consider, based on Aristotle, he basically considered, well, the kind of person that you should be. And in other words, there's an idea that we know, we have some form of a feeling that we know that being honest is good. Therefore, we recognize that we have to be honest because we feel it on the inside that, hey, this is what it means to be good. So we know that honesty is good. We know that killing is bad. Therefore, that's what we should be abiding by. We recognize some certain things in our fitrah. That is, of course. The divine command theory, they would consider, no, we would have religion, and religion would basically determine what is good for us, and therefore that's supposed to be the basis. Now, here's the thing, is that all these areas, they basically plagiarized let's say it that way, plagiarize ethics from religions. Let's see the relativism, which is the era that we're living in. Well, there's no area that we would turn to in order to define good or bad for us. We would basically see if something is morally right, if a society accepts it as right, then therefore we would just consider it as right. We just have to let the people determine whether this should be acceptable or not, and not necessarily the religion, not necessarily looking at the consequence, because according to the relativism theory, which really is based on atheism, that they would consider that there's nothing to prove that there is a basis for anything, and everything is created or founded on absurdity. Therefore, there's no paradigm of truth. That's what it basically considered it as. So therefore, since there's no paradigm, everything is matter in motion, there is no meaning, there is no purpose to life, there is no meaning to life, then therefore it's all an absurdity. And what we would consider if something is morally right, in other words, people accept it as that way, we'll just accept it that way. That's why you had someone like you're talking about Richard Dawkins. He said when he was asked about cannibalism, he said, well, I just don't have the taste for it, but morally there's nothing wrong with it. To actually, just imagine people eating each other. And you said, well, I don't have anything to prove that it's wrong. Well, based on the relativism theory, he's right. The relativism theory, if we're just matter in motion and you don't really have any evidence to prove something is morally right or wrong, you don't have a foundation, you don't have a reference to support mannerisms, you're eventually going to live this kind of this kind of a wild life where, hey, I don't have anything to prove that something is morally right or wrong. The society doesn't accept it, so I'll just take their word for it. But that's because life doesn't have any basis. It's just in absurdity anyways. And therefore, just imagine with this whole idea of relativism, how we can be, hey, as long as you don't get caught, incest, no problem with it. Killing other people, massive killing, as long as you don't get caught, nothing wrong with it. And of course, you're killing babies, killing anything, nothing wrong with it as long as you don't get caught. That's all that matters. If the society accepts it, it's okay. Then you could just do it. Oh, the society accepted the killing or gassing millions of people. Oh, that's okay if everybody's accepting it. Hey, the Nazis committed all these acts. It's okay. If the West basically considered that, yes, killing 300,000 Namibians, or even perhaps 50% of the nation. Well, I mean, if the society accepted it that it was necessary in order to get the resources, that's the only way to do it, it should be okay. Look at the society. And that's what we're living in. We're living in these ideas that founded what is considered as modern West, and what is considered as Renaissance, what is considered as the modern civilization. The modern civilization was actually based on these ideas. So long for this modern civilization that basically had brought about all of those atrocities. Never in history did we actually have a number in these kinds of people that were killed in, of course, a presentation and in a way that it was presented as legal, because it was the ends that justify the means. No civilization has blood on its hands as much as today's Western civilization. Straightforward. And for the first time in history, you could say even when we're speaking about the world wars. Of course, they would like to present it as, well, it's the religion that is responsible for all these wars, and it's religion that basically is presenting all these wars throughout history. But it is actually important to mention that secularism had actually killed a lot, secularism had actually killed a lot more people than any other civilization in history. In history, you name the civilization, whether you're speaking about Roman, you're speaking about Byzantine, you're speaking about Persian, you name the history, you name the civilization, never was it whatsoever as bloody as the civilization of our modern times, or the Jahiliyyah as our modern times. Modern times, of course, postmodernism is basically all about the majority opinion, but isn't the majority opinion, whether we're speaking about the Nazis, or whether we're speaking about, hey, it was voted for to go to Iraq, it was voted for to go for support Israel, it was voted for to support the killing of the killing in Algeria, it was voted for the killing in Africa, it was voted for. It was the majority's opinion. It was a political lobbying. That's why in Islam, of course, when we're speaking about morally right, not because we're seeing that it was voted for to accept abortion, it doesn't make it right. Not because it's voted for LGBT, it doesn't make it right. Not because we're seeing the redefinition of human rights, it doesn't make it right. No, it will be considered as something that is as a crime if it's going against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Simple as that. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it a final announcement. The Lord Almighty orders for justice and ihsan. What is al-ihsan? Which is better, al-adl or al-ihsan? Al-adl is supposed to be justice. What is justice? What's the difference between adl and ihsan? Al-adl is justice. Is there anything better than justice? Yes, there is. What can be better than justice? Al-ihsan. Because al-adl is basically equity. Al-ihsan, no, it's to give in even when the other person probably doesn't deserve it. You're giving in. You're compromising. You're trying to be merciful. That's al-ihsan. وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى. How is the foundation going to happen? There's no way that you're going to be capable of living al-adl and al-ihsan if you didn't live it within your home. Within your home is where morality starts. إِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى. Give for the relatives. Share with your brother and your sister, because if you don't share with your brother and sister, if you're not living morality with your brother and sister, with your mother and father, you're not recognizing what your mother and father had contributed in your life, then you're not recognizing what anyone contributed to make your life the life that you're living right now. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, well, ita, to give in, even when they're not giving you anything in return. Yes, because what you're waiting for is not a return from them. You're waiting for the return to be from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ينهى عن الفحشاء. ينهى عن الفحشاء, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set a certain paradigm, set a number of different areas. Al-fahsha, transgression. What kind of transgression? We're talking about transgression in one. Al-fahsha is usually in family, in basically, it can be in chastity, and al-fahsha can be in words. That's al-fuhsh. And al-tafahush, it's in words. Using words of profanity. These words of profanity, they'll take you a step farther. If you're constantly using words of profanity, you're going to see that il-munkar is going to be the next step. That acting upon these words is going to be something that you would allow. Il-munkar. That's permissible. a transgression. And then you're going to get into another step, aggression. You started out with some form of oral transgression, and then you went into another type of a transgression, and then you went into another type of aggression. Now you're trying to do what? Now you're trying to force it upon others and trying to say, no, I'm going to fiercely apply this because you're going to present yourself that you have the right. You were in the beginning creating a narrative. It was a narrative. It was a word of mouth. But then from a word of mouth to probably even going farther and hitting the person, attacking the person, and then you finally went into another stage of giving yourself the justification to somehow transgress the limit on all ends. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَعِظُكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ, that the Lord Almighty is giving us that maw'idha, giving us that reminder, because there's no way that you could be living that level of akhlaq if the person doesn't surround themselves with al-wala and al-bara to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-wala, you're centered around Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Well, what does that mean? You're centered around Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His wahi, He's the one that defines akhlaq. He's the one that defines morality. Morality in where the preservation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, spirituality, the preservation, the sanctity of human life is the second thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considered. And therefore, when you're looking at these areas, the preservation of human life, the sanctity of human mind, the sanctity of family and chastity, the sanctity of wealth and property, Islam tells us, no, don't be fooled by how many would want to define and change the narrative, what it means to live justice, and recognize that there are certain foundations that you would find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered certain foundations within the society, within nature, and therefore you cannot change it. You cannot change the truth of the fact that Allah, the truth of the matter that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had founded things within nature and founded things within His book. And therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there tells us that these are the legal maxims. This is what acts as the foundation of justice, acts as the foundation of morality, preservation of people's deen. Let them see the world in the right angle. Let them recognize truth. Once they recognize truth, then you're going to see people's lives being protected and not justifications given there and letting people basically suffer and then telling them that it was justifiable because these people are closer to the apes in evolution. Human life is to be regarded as protected. Human life is sacred. And that's the same thing with their mind. That's the same thing with their chastity and protection for the protection of family. And that you cannot justify yourself that and say that the ends justify the means. And that's why with the wealth and property, it is to be protected and preserved for the people, and not because a certain philosophy had regarded that if there's a certain consent, that's going to be the area that is sanctuary. Yes, definitely, Islam did consider that consent has a special place of sanctity, but your sanctity, your consent does not go beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sanctity. Allahu Akbar. Not because you accepted something, not because you consented something, you cannot consider it that, yes, I define morality. No, you don't define morality. Even if you consent to it, yes, your consent does not go beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's consent. Your liberty is defined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The property and what acts as a property is defined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why the Prophet ﷺ actually taught us. A man, he comes to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, أَيُّ ذَنْبِ أَعْظَمُ? What's the worst sin that anyone can do? And he said, أَن تَجْعَلِ اللَّهِ نِدًّا وَهُوَ خَلَقَكَ. What's the worst sin? He said it's to associate it or even to regard yourself on the same level of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when He's the one that created you. How is that supposed to be like that? When we're talking about تَجْعَلْ لِلَّهِ نِدًّا, what does that mean? You're going to regard yourself, even if it means for you to consider yourself as, oh, I basically would present my consent, therefore you should respect it. No, not if it goes against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what He approves. That's a form of going against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's a form that you had made yourself on the level of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when He's the one that created you. He said then what else? He said, أَن تَقْتُلَ وَلَدَكَ خَشْيَةَ أَن يَأْكُلَ مَعَكَ. It's to kill your son. The second worst sin is to kill your son because you're fearful that he might share some of your property or might eat with you. In other words, first, in the first one, you made yourself as the one to be at the same level to define morality as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You made yourself as a center. Then, in application, you went and killed your own son because you regarded that, why should I split my share, my property with him? What did you consider yourself? You considered yourself here as the center in the first one, when you had made Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as basically your consent is to be regarded as what defines morality. Then that basically put you on the same level. But then in the second category, you basically regarded that your property, your space is to be regarded as the center. You went from regarding yourself as the center to regarding your space and what belongs to you as the center. So you gave yourself the justification to go and kill your son because you didn't want to share your space. Your property, you didn't want to share it because you regarded that, no, it all belongs to me. Then the final one, he said, أَن تُزَانِي حَلِيلَةَ جَارِكَ. It's to commit zina, any sexual act, whether there was consent or not. With who? With your neighbor. How is that together? I want to look at this hadith and where it went from a person, one, considering themselves the same level of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and of course this is talking about legislature. And then the second one, considering killing their own son because they didn't want to share property with them. But then the final one is to consider that committing zina, even if it's consensual, with your neighbor as worse than committing zina, even if it's consensual, with probably someone that is farther than your neighbor. How is that even worse? Well, that's because there was some form of trust that you were given. But then you had exceeded your position and your status. And then here you exceeded your property and you regarded it that it all belongs to you. And here you exceeded your space. You exceeded your space and you regarded that your space and that you have the right to exceed your space from your home to even going to your neighbor's home and sleep and cheat on your neighbor by sleeping with his wife. You exceeded the space. And this is extremely important. Even though you could see all of those areas, some of them might be, like this one, might be consensual, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considered that no. These are the worst sins. So the ayah was revealed, وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَدْعُونَ مَعَ اللَّهِ إِلَهًا آخَرَ وَلَا يَقْتُلُونَ النَّفْسَ الَّتِي حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ وَلَا يَزْنُونَ وَمَن يَفْعَلْ ذَلِكَ يَلْقَى أَثَامًا. In Surah Al-Furqan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said and confirmed this answer. Those that لا يدعون مع الله إلها آخر. لا يدعون means لا يعبدون. Those that would not worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ولا يقتلون النفس التي حرم الله إلا بالحق. And they would not kill any life that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as sanctuary. And ولا يزنون, and they would not commit zina. وما يفعل ذلك يلقى أثاما. And whoever does any of these things, يلقى أثاما, they would be held accountable. يضاعف له العذاب. On Judgment Day, the punishment would be multiplied for them. ويخلد فيه مهانة. ويخلد فيه مهانة. Why مهانة? And they would stay in hellfire. The word that was used is muhana, humiliated. Why humiliated? Because when the person had put themselves in a position where they would consider themselves as, well, they gave consent, therefore it should be acceptable, and considered themselves as nid, as on the same level of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they had regarded themselves as superior. They were living some form of the self-supremacy. And then أن تقتل ولدك خشية أن يأكل معك. And then they lived another form of supremacy, went beyond and considered that no, they can even kill their own sons because their supremacy, they regarded that no, I would not, even if it's my own son, I would not share any property or anything with them. And then they regarded that based on that, their narcissist slash supremacist ego, it went beyond and regarded that they have the right to even exceed the border of their own home and actually engage in different in sexual acts with his own neighbor. You could see that one leads to the other. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was taking us and letting us recognize what it means to really live what it means to really live Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's definition of haqq, that at the end, be careful from living مَن لَعَنَهُ اللَّهُ وَغَضِبَ عَلَيْهِ. There's nothing worse than living who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the life who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had cursed, or even غَضِبَ عَلَيْهِ, or even went into the consequence. Because they were talking about the philosophy that, well, we'll look at what is moral based on the consequence, and the consequence was going to tell us whether something is acceptable or not. We're going to look at what it leads to. We're going to look at the actions and what it leads to, and that, therefore, that's what we're going to define. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, fair enough. Those that their actions had led them to getting cursed, getting, of course, not part of those that were included in the rahmah, in the forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and وَعَبَدَ الطَّاغُوتِ. And they would عَبَدَ الطَّاغُوتِ. What does it mean to عَبَدَ الطَّاغُوتِ? Why is عَبَدَ الطَّاغُوتِ right there even included in all of this? And this is actually going to take us just a little farther when you're looking at عَبَدَ الطَّاغُوتِ. What does it mean to worship الطاغوت? So what does it mean to worship الطاغوت when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that they're in the worst place? وَأَضَلُّ عَنْ سَوَاءِ السَّبِيلِ. And they even went farther than the straight path. So what happened? What is the word adal? Why is it even mentioned here? They were self-manipulated. How did they get into that manipulation? How did we get there? And that's why I actually wanted to take you right there, and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, tells us about الطاغوت. Well, in order to understand the طاغوت, we would have to go back to the root. So let's say الطاغوت is basically coming from the root طغى. طغى means to go beyond the limit. جاوز القدر, or to exceed the limit. So what does it mean? And of course, we would know that every single one, كل ذي طغيان على الله, anything or anyone that goes basically beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether in worship or whether in obedience to other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it was a human being, or whether that was some form of a shaitan, or whether that was some form of a pagan thing that they were worshiping, or whether that was some form of an idol, or whether no matter what that thing was, at the end, it would be considered a taghut. So I want you to focus on this one, that it could also be a human being. And that's why when you look at Ibn al-Qayyim wrote this book, I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in. This is actually one of the most important books. It's almost in, well, it was in two big, super big volumes, I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in. And the book is quite advanced in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in. I would say more of maybe talking about legal maxims, understanding maqasid sharia, understanding the details. And let's see what he said. And he said, quote, "At-taghut, anything that the servant would use it in order, basically, exceed the limit of what is to be worshipped or followed or obeyed." So every single group, basically, they would, if they were to have a taghut, they would basically turn to it. يتحاكمون إليه. I want you to look at this one. If they were to turn to it as basically the area for what? The area as legislating. The area they would regard it as the foundation, as basically the area that defines morality. If it's other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger, or they would worship other than Allah, or they would follow it, of course, with no insight by going through the Quran and Sunnah to help them define things by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or they would obey and they wouldn't even know why they're obeying it. It's right, everybody's doing it. Then this would be considered as a taghut if you were to really closely ponder in it. And if you were to look at most people, and you would see most of them, they would really not worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they would basically worship at-taghut. At-taghut meaning this area that basically is defining morality for them, defining everything. And if, of course, they would not rule by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger, and they would rule by this area, could be feminism, could be secularism, could be liberalism, could be whatever ism, and they would consider that as their place of obedience and therefore their place of definition, then in that situation, that would be a form of taghut. Let's see another one. It's here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَمَن يَكْفُرْ بِالطَّاغُوتِ وَيُؤْمِن بِاللَّهِ فَقَدْ اسْتَمْسَكَ بِالْعُرْوَةِ الْوُثْقَى لَا انْفِصَامَ لَهَا. Let's see, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we did this one in Surah Al-Baqarah. He said, whoever disbelieves, in other words, rejects the taghut, we just said what taghut is, and believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَقَدْ اسْتَمْسَكَ بِالْعُرْوَةِ الْوُثْقَى. Then they held on, so kind of like the prime, the main key, الْعُرْوَةِ الْوُثْقَى. What is al-urwa? Al-urwa is the knot. But this isn't talking about a knot of something. The knot, we're talking about K-N-O-T. This isn't talking about the knot of something, but this is a metaphor. So what, if you were to have two strings and you want to put them together, you would tie them together. So that's the knot. It's basically keeping two things together, which is one, you, and basically connecting you with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or dunya and akhirah. You're connecting them together. Okay, بالعروة الوثقى, but this isn't any kind of a knot. It's basically a knot that is fastened and well fastened. لا انفصام لها. There's no division, there's no separation. Wallahu Sami'un Alim. Why Sami'un Alim? Because He knows what is out there. He knows what you're doing, and He knows what is best for you. So when we're speaking about this knot, you're following Sharia right there. Let's see, Muhammad al-Amin al-Shinqiti, in fact, he's actually one of my professor's professor at the university. Okay, he said, والتحقيق أن كل ما عبد من دون الله فهو طاغوت. And he said, with scrutiny and with study, everything that is worshipped other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to be considered taghut. And certainly, this all goes back to who? This all goes back to shaitan. Let's see, Ibn Atiyah, basically al-Andalusi, and he said, and some scholars had said everything that was worshipped other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to be considered taghut. And he said, and this explanation or this naming is anything that is worshipped other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether it's Fir'aun or whether it's a Namrud, basically the treasurer for Fir'aun, basically, or anything that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept, even if it's Uzair or Isa alayhi salam or Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, to worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told you, never did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told you to worship Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, or worship al-Hussein, or worship Isa. He didn't tell you to worship any of those. Those were prophets, or at least Isa, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, those were prophets. Hussein alayhi salam was basically the Prophet's grandson, but you don't worship him. So to say, Ya Hussein, or etc., that no, you don't worship, that's a taghut then. Even if they were to worship, well, you are practicing the taghut, that doesn't mean Isa alayhi salam had accepted this. And of course, وَمَا لَا يُعْقَلْ, and it could also be things that would be definitely not logical to worship, whether we're speaking about different idols, and they definitely, it wasn't logical that they were worshiping them, so it was metaphorically considered a taghut, even though they weren't accepting it. In other words, these idols didn't even have anything to do with this. So let's see, Ibn Taymiyyah had said, a taghut comes from the word طغيان, to exceed the limit, and therefore anything that is exceeding the limit in oppression or aggression, then in that situation, anything to be worshipped outside of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to be considered as a taghut. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ had basically considered in the authentic hadith anything وَيَتَّبِعْ مَنْ يَعْبُدُ الطَّاغِيتَ. Okay, and well, basically anything that would worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's the same thing. Whoever is also obeyed in of course, in objection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in other words, in committing sin, that's also going to be considered taghut. You obeyed that. So whether that philosophy was considered feminism, whatever that philosophy was called, then in that situation it would be considered taghut. So even if it wasn't a particular thing, even if it's an idea, the idea itself takes you back all the way to shaitan. So in that situation, because it is objecting and going against the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or against basically what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as permissible or moral, then in that situation it would be considered taghut. So taghut, everything that goes in, whether in worship or in obedience to, or considering it as the center that one would follow. Okay, so الطواغيت, they could be many. Let's see, could be shaitan, could be it could be a leader, political leader, or it could be to perhaps commit certain things, such as for example, accepting bribery, or to accept that people would worship that person, or even a person that probably is engaging in certain practices because the culture is probably considering that that's acceptable, when they could be just completely ignorant about it. So in that situation, when we're looking at anything that would change what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as part of Sharia, and if the person is accepting it, then in that situation, that would be considered as leaving Islam. Let's see Ibn Kathir. Ibn Kathir, he said, whoever leaves what was revealed onto Muhammad ibn Abdullah, that is the last prophet and the final prophet, and what then would regard other legislations as basically abrogating the Sharia of Islam, is basically considered committing kufr. Just look at that. And just put that within that context. Okay, so I'll just end it right here, inshallah. And there's definitely a lot more to say, but to conclude, of course, the whole idea when we're speaking about, well, the context, I wanted to get to, well, why did it say هل تنقمون? What was the idea? What was, of course, the ayat, what were the ayat basically wanting to lay out? It was wanting to lay out a foundation of what makes morality, number one, and number two, how they are also exposed to living the discrepancy, how they would redefine and define morality not based on what really suits justice or what is justice, but they would define it based on their choices, based on their whims, and not necessarily what is right, and certainly not necessarily to what leads to the good consequences, and they would end up living أضلوا عن سواء السبيل. They would be living in self-manipulation, and they would come forward and they would claim that they were believers. They would really just go from one type of kufr to another, and without them realizing, taking them on paths of course, delusion. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, want you to look at this one. The Prophet ﷺ drew a line. Let's look at that line. And he basically said right there, and he said in this line, he basically drew a line and drew many lines. And he said, this is the line to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these are the lines that lead to shaitan. Just keep that in mind. So this could be called feminism. This could be called secularism. The lines can go on and on and on and on. They could be endless. And they just went from this line to this line. دخلوا بالكفر. And what happened? وَالْخَرَجُوا بِهِ. They just went, this is kufr and this is kufr. They just went from one line to another. And then they would think that they're actually doing the right thing, when in reality, دخلوا بالكفر وهم قد خرجوا به. They just changed really lines, but it's really in the same way, in the same place. It wasn't at all a line of haqq. It wasn't a line of truth. It wasn't a line that was coming and going towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They didn't go that way whatsoever. What they were really living in, they just moved from one line to another. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically telling us the psychology that they're living in. كثيرا منهم يسارعون في الإثم والعدوان. Many of them, they would basically, because they don't have their lines in place, they don't even have their definitions in place. What happens? Well, they would engage in different forms of transgression. They would right there give themselves the justification to go against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then they would basically consider themselves as the center for truth. أكلهم السحت. Exactly. That's what even you see the Western countries have done. Basically go and steal the resources from Africa, give themselves the justification to steal these resources. And this is basically right there. Even the foundation of what you would see, even on a personal level, you could see how the society right now, even in the West, of course, people basically living single parents, the children don't even have the rights. The woman is basically asked to do double the jobs and take care of the home, to run after this man to basically pay child support, and the man is basically finding different ways to not pay child support, and end up really what happened? أكلهم السحت. لبئس ما كانوا يصنعون. What does it lead to? Well, بئس ما كانوا يصنعون. It basically leads to nothing but بئس. It's like it's nothing but leading to one. It's definitely البئس is the opposite of ni'mah. So you're seeing nothing but instability, nothing but البؤس, nothing but sorrow, nothing but it's definitely leading to al-bi'sa is not necessarily al-bu's, but al-bi'sa is really that it's leading to nothing but instability, nothing but transgression. And of course, you could see this life that they're actually living in, where it's nothing but transgression, nothing but, of course, it's presented that it's bringing in civilization, but we could see, of course, crimes being on the rise, single parents being on the rise, and of course, more and more political instability, more and more aggression. Right now, hey, giving Israel, of course, the green light to go and start attacking Lebanon, and down the road, perhaps even go and attack Syria and claim that there are certain terrorists there. So let's go and attack Syria, wipe it, and basically throw all these nuclear bombs on them. Big deal. Who cares? They're not even human because, anyways, they're subhuman. So because why? Well, because they're not like the Western blood. So it doesn't matter how many casualties from the Syrians, from the Lebanese, from the Palestinians, from later on, perhaps even the Jordanians. Doesn't matter. Maybe the Iraqis too, maybe the Iranians. Well, it doesn't matter because they're subhuman. Hey, after all, the Africans, they were subhuman. We didn't care that 300,000 millions. Doesn't matter. Same thing. Native Americans. Oh, Native Australians. Doesn't matter. And that's the same thing. Without us realizing, it's about time where even the Western society recognizes, let's say, the discrepancy, the contradiction, the atrocities that such philosophy had really brought to humanity in the name of civilization, in the name of liberty, in the name of basically giving a certain group of people the right to basically harm people. And then what do? We give this democracy and making these politicians basically making us feel that we are deciding, we are choosing, when in reality these politicians are basically getting richer and the masses are getting poor. But then what you see democracy manipulating, and of course the system right now manipulating people to think that it's giving them freedom, it's giving them consent, it's giving them justice, when in reality it's nothing but a manipulation on them. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. I know it kind of went in different angles. So if there are any questions before we would end today, I couldn't stop in the middle. There was so much to say.
What does udwan mean?
Udwan means transgression on people's rights.
Okay.
Yep. You're attacking people like that. So this is it, inshallah. I know we definitely surpassed the time because we started at supposedly 11:30, but inshallah, we just had to complete the topic for today. We couldn't stop in the middle. So this is it, inshallah. And